Audiobook Academy. Book Summary. Hiroshima. By John Hersey. The American novelist John Hersey's 1946 novel Hiroshima was published in the United States. August 1946 saw the publication of an article in The New Yorker that would become the basis for the novel. After initially planning to spread the subject out over multiple issues, the magazine decided to focus on just one, instead. Alfred A. Knopf published an adaptation of the article into a book only 2 months later. In total, it has sold more than 3 million copies to this point. Science fiction has been attributed with a new wave in storytelling that revolves around a everyman character after reading this book about Hiroshima and Nagasaki's first nuclear bombing. In the early hours of August 6, 1945, the morning after the first atomic bomb was launched on Japan, 6 ordinary Japanese individuals share their stories in Hiroshima. Hersey was among the first Western journalists to inspect Hiroshima's post-bomb damage in the aftermath of the bombing. The New Yorker asked him to write a series of pieces about the explosion's impact on a diverse group of everyday people. She uses vivid and often gory detail to convey these genuine stories in her book. Synopsis. The first chapter of the novel introduces the 6 protagonists and explains what they were doing on the morning of August 6, 1945, the day of the explosion. As of yet, Hiroshima has been spared from the American attacks that have devastated many other Japanese cities, and there are some speculations that the city may be being saved for something special. Mr. Kiyoshi Tanimoto is the first character to be introduced. Reverend Tanimoto received his formal education in the United States and now serves as a minister in Japan. Having returned to Japan after an extended absence, Mr. Tanimoto has offered to help with air raid defenses as a means to show his countrymanship. He is helping a friend's daughter relocate to a new house outside the city center the morning of the blast. He is only 2 miles away from the blast's epicenter. After the bomb detonates, Mr. Tanimoto is forced to take refuge in a nearby garden. Mrs. Hatsuyo Nakamura is the second character to be introduced. A mother of 3, Mrs. Nakamura is a single parent. Mrs. Nakamura had to relocate her tiny children every time an air raid warning is issued. There have been no explosions in Hiroshima yet, so Mrs. Nakamura is weighing the benefits of rousing her children and getting them out of bed. Mrs. Nakamura decides to disregard the air raid siren for the time being until she hears a more specific warning from her neighbor. Mrs. Nakamura's neighbor is murdered instantaneously when the bomb goes off 3/4 of a mile from her house. In the third and last character, Dr. Masakazu Fuji, who owns a private hospital overlooking the river, is depicted. He recently had to turn away several patients since he couldn't relocate them to a safe area every time the air raid siren sounded. There are now only 2 patients in his practice. Dr. Fuji awoke early on the morning of the blast so that he could accompany a friend to the train station and read the newspaper on his porch. When the bomb detonates, it hits the clinic, knocking Dr. Fuji and the clinic into the river. He is Father Wilhelm Kleinsorge, a German Jesuit priest serving in Hiroshima as a missionary. As a result of his recent illness, the father is sound asleep when the bomb goes off. Despite its seismic resistance, the mission home does not fall over. That Father Kleinsorge and his companions are still alive is all because to this. This novel's 5th protagonist is Dr. Terufumi Sasaki, a fresh-faced surgeon at the Red Cross Medical Center. Dr. Sasaki is unable to sleep on the morning of the explosion, so he takes an earlier train to work than normal. If Dr. Sasaki had ridden his customary train, he would have been killed by the blast because of the timing and location. Because he is standing in front of an open window, he is unharmed when the bomb goes off. Dr. Sasaki jumps right into tending to the wounds of those in his immediate vicinity. Miss Toshiko Sasaki, a 20-year-old clerk at the East Asia Tin Works, completes the cast as the final character. To help her family, Miss Sasaki has a part-time job. Her leg is crushed and she is knocked unconscious as the bookcase falls on top of her in her office after the bomb detonates. As we learn in Chapter 2, the blast was smaller than Mr. Tanimoto first anticipated, and the damage was only to the area around him. It turns out that this notion is erroneous when he climbs over the wreckage to see it from a different angle. A distressed Mr. Tanimoto immediately begins sprinting toward the city center in search of his wife and baby daughter. He is surrounded by charred and injured survivors as they make their way out of the blast zone. Mr. Tanimoto is unhurt, and he feels ashamed and terrible about it. He begs for pardon from everyone he comes into contact with. People's shouts echo through the streets below him as he sprints to escape the encroaching debris. Mr. Tanimoto somehow locates his wife and daughter, who are both unharmed. Meanwhile, Mrs. Nakamura begins searching amid the ruins of her house for her missing children. Asano Park, a former estate on the outskirts of town, has been designated as an evacuation location in the wake of the disaster. In order to prevent any looters from stealing her sewing machine, Mrs. Nakamura first places it in the water tank of her home. Father Schiffer, a priest at the mission house, has been seriously hurt and must be rushed to the hospital. Several of the other priests are looking for a doctor and digging people out of nearby demolished homes. The entire time they're doing this, Father Kleinsorge is in his room getting his stuff together. When he opens his suitcase, he is relieved to see that it was completely unscathed by the explosion. "Thank you, God," Father Kleinsorge says. Father Schiffer's other priests are unable to get him medical attention, so they head to Asano Park. As a result, Father Kleinsorge is forced to physically remove Mr. Fukai, the secretary of the Diocese of Tokyo, from the mission house. A frail Father Kleinsorge loses control of Mr. Fukai in the bomb zone, and the man flees, never to be seen again. The blast injures Dr. Fuji, and the clinic he is working in falls, killing everyone else, including the 2 patients he was treating at the time. As the blast started, fires spread, he and others seek cover in the river. Dr. Sasaki, one of a handful of unharmed doctors in the city, is compelled to begin working on tens of thousands of patients who begin pouring into the hospital. In order to save as many people as possible, Dr. Sasaki continues to question what form of weapon could have created such a constant level of devastation in the world. Miss Sasaki is seriously hurt in the tin works factory. At times, she is unconscious and trapped to the bookshelves for an extended period of time. With 2 other injured persons, she is rescued and taken to an improvised shelter. For many of the evacuated citizens of Hiroshima, Asano Park acts as an oasis of safety. As a result, the estate quickly becomes overcrowded and the city's flames threaten it. Using garments and buckets of water, Mr. Tanimoto and Father Kleinsorge led an effort to put out the blaze. Asano Park lies near a river, and many of the trapped survivors try to drink the river's water on the first day after the explosion, only to learn that it is contaminated and grow ill as a result. In the evening, a Navy ship heads up the river and tells the survivors to be patient and wait for aid. As the first sign of outside assistance, this gives the residents of Asano Park hope. In spite of his failing health, Father Kleinsorge manages to find some working faucets and provide clean water to the park's residents. He stumbles upon a group of severely damaged troops as he walks through the woods. Their eyes are melting and their mouths are bloated from the trauma. There will be help for them, but he doubts it will arrive in time for them to be saved. A pair of young siblings who have come to believe that their mother has died find solace in him. Father Schiffer and Father LaSalle enter on stretchers from the novitiate. They take Mrs. Nakamura and her children back to the novitiate with them. Kleinsorge returns to the city to make a police report. Radio broadcasts from the government reveal that they suspect a new type of bomb was used against the city, which no one in the park hears. Using a tiny canoe, Mr. Tanimoto sets off down the river. Many individuals are stranded on the riverbank, including 2 seriously burned young girls and 20 others unable to move because they are laying on sandpits. Some of the men and women are so badly burned that they are slipping skin off when moved. The rising tide had carried away many of the people he had moved away from the water after he took a brief nap, so he returned to find that he had made a mistake. As a result, Mr. Tanimoto travels to the East Parade Ground Medical Station to chastise a doctor for failing to aid the injured in Asano Park. They tell him that he is focusing on those with less critical injuries because those with more significant wounds are going to die regardless. Dr. Sasaki works 19-hour shifts to care for the injured at the Red Cross hospital. The dead bodies pile up around him because no one is around to remove them. He sleeps for an hour after working for 19 hours, then gets up to finish the day's tasks. It takes Dr. Sasaki till August 8 to return home and tell his mother that he is alive. Dr. Fuji, unable to aid anyone, spent several days lying on the floor of his parents' roofless house before finally making it to a friend's house. Miss Sasaki has been left for 2 days in the courtyard of the tin works factory, hidden behind a makeshift lean-to. To her horror, her parents and brother are all presumed to have died on August 8. After that, she's transferred to a number of hospitals where she sits through discussions with medical staff on whether or not to amputate her leg. The leg is eventually discarded since it is severely fractured, but it can still be repaired. On the island of Hiroshima, she is transferred to a military hospital where she is treated for her wounds. It was just a matter of time before the Hiroshima people eventually came to terms with the depth of their city's destruction and their own personal losses. As the second bomb hits Nagasaki, News of the inhabitants' relatives begins to filter down to the survivors. However, the Nakamuras arrive at the novitiate with a severe case of the flu. Her mother, sister, and younger brother were all killed in the explosion. Mr. Tanimoto is summoned to the deathbed of an old enemy, who is surprised to hear him read from the Psalms as he passes away, even though the guy used to be a vocal opponent of Christianity. 1 or 2 days later, she is removed from medical care at the military hospital and sent to a ship, where the strong sunshine on deck exacerbates her leg illness even further. The sheer quantity of patients that the city's doctors and hospitals must cope with is overwhelming. They begin burying the dead and putting their ashes in envelopes to be stacked. During the early hours of August 15, Japan's Emperor Tenno announced over the radio that the country had surrendered unconditionally and the war was finished. However, the effects of the explosion are still being felt. Radiation illness strikes the city's residents weeks after the bombing. He is the first of the key characters to fall ill with the disease. In the middle of a long trip around the city, he suddenly feels weak and has difficulty returning. She and her small daughter become ill when Mrs. Nakamura's hair falls off. Mr. Tanimoto, on the other hand, falls ill and is forced to spend the night in the hospital. The tiny hemorrhages that cover Miss Sasaki's body are discovered by Dr. Sasaki when she is moved to the Red Cross hospital from another facility. Although he thinks it's an odd symptom, several of his patients have recently developed it. Upon further investigation, he discovers that this is an indication of radiation illness, caused by a low white blood cell count. Dr. Fuji, who has made a partial recovery, is able to treat a few patients at the home of a friend in Fukawa. Heavy rains begin to fall in early September, causing Dr. Fuji's improvised clinic to be washed away by the river. Doctors and residents of the city are still baffled by the radiation sickness. Mrs. Nakamura and Mr. Tanimoto are gradually recovering from their illnesses, but Father Kleinsorge continues to deteriorate at an alarming pace. In Toiko, he is taken to a hospital where he is diagnosed only a few weeks to live. In spite of this, he begins to recuperate and becomes somewhat of a media sensation in Tokyo. Many doctors, as well as some media reporters, have sought to interview him. Physicists return to the blast site in Hiroshima to continue their documentation and research. A new theory about radiation sickness begins to take shape as Dr. Sasaki and his associates observe it unfold in their patients. The infection in Miss Sasaki's body persists well into the winter, and she gets despondent as a result of her extended stay in the hospital. Because her fiancé hasn't shown up to visit her in the last few months. Upon returning to the city, Father Kleinsorge sees Miss Sasaki, who appears to be energized by his presence. By April, she's on the mend and can walk with crutches again. People in Hiroshima and the people in the novel are gradually resuming certain aspects of their daily routines. Dr. Fuji creates a new clinic and takes advantage of the surge of American tourists by treating them. Another mission home is being constructed by Father Kleinsorge and his associates. Kleinsorge, on the other hand, becomes unwell yet again as a result of his frantic pace and must spend another night in a Tokyo hospital. Tanimoto also strives to rebuild his church but lacks the financial resources to do it effectively. It's not long before Mrs. Nakamura's hair grows back and she can afford a new home near her old one, even if it's a rundown shanty town. School reopens and Mrs. Nakamura re-enrolls her kids in class once more after a long absence. Dr. Sasaki's hectic pace after the blast slows down and he is given more time for recuperation and self-reflection. In the following March, he gets married. John Hersey returned to Hiroshima 40 years after the bombing to find out what had happened to the 6 survivors he had written about. The New Yorker reported his following discoveries, which were then included as an epilogue to the book. Chapter 5, the book's final chapter, was derived from this. Radiation sickness was a problem for many businesses in the early years after the bomb was detonated. Ms. Nakamura was impoverished for a long period as a result. She worked in a mothball factory for 13 years and was only able to retire when her oldest son, Toshio, started working to support the family. Mrs. Nakamura began to rely on her pension after her children had married and gone away. An act offering monthly pensions to those who were affected by the blast in 1975 was passed 30 years later. After that, Mrs. Nakamura enjoys a comfortable life and begins dancing professionally. She participates in a commemorative festival in Hiroshima on the 40th anniversary of the bombing. After the incident, the victims were referred to as hibakusha, literally explosion-affected folks, in Japan. While working at the hospital following the bombing, Dr. Sasaki devotes much of his time to aiding the survivors. In 1951, He leaves to open his own clinic in Mukihara. His wife succumbed to breast cancer in 1972 and he nearly died in 1963 when he had a lung removed. This setback just motivates him to work even harder, and he plans to use the wealth he's amassed from his clinic to expand his network of medical institutions. When it comes time to apply for citizenship in Japan, Father Kleinsorge decides to go by the name of Father Makoto Takakura instead of his given name. In spite of the fact that he has never fully recovered from his radiation sickness, he works tirelessly to help those who have been harmed by the explosion. In 1961, he relocates to a little church in Mukihara, where he meets his cook, Satsuya Shiki, and the two become friends. In 1977, he falls and breaks his leg, and he remains bedridden for the rest of his life. In Hersey's words, the flowers at his grave are always preserved in a cool, dry place. The wounded limb of Miss Sasaki is repaired 3 times, but she never fully recovers. She spends a short time working in orphanages before becoming a nun in 1957 under the guidance of Father Kleinsorge. Sister Dominique Sasaki has a distinguished career and travels the world. At a meal in Tokyo in 1980, she relates her memories following the Hiroshima bombing. There are times when I feel like I have been given a second chance at life, and I want to use it wisely. A new clinic in Hiroshima is built by Dr. Fuji, and he begins to drink, party and relax in attempt to alleviate his suffering. Working with unmarried female burn victims known as Hiroshima maidens, he begins helping them have plastic surgery. In 1963, a gas leak in Dr. Fuji's house renders him comatose, and he is sent to the hospital. After this, he enters a coma and dies. To help the Hiroshima victims and fund a Japanese peace center, Mr. Tanimoto travels to the United States to give speeches and gather money. Along the way, he runs into author Pearl Buck, and the two begin working together. Because of his attention-seeking nature, many Japanese and American people finally perceive him to have quit his campaign. Although he runs a tiny adoption facility out of his house, his peace center never comes to fruition. Mrs. Hatsuyo Nakamura, a widow raising 3 children on her own. Mrs. Nakamura is fatigued at the beginning of the novel because she has to collect her children and move them to a safe spot every time the air raid alarm goes off. Assuming the siren is a false alarm on the morning of August 6, she lets her children sleep in peace. She witnesses her neighbor's death and then has to rescue her children from the wreckage of her own house after the bomb goes off. She takes her children to the Asano Park safe zone, where they will be taken to a Jesuit novitiate after a few days there. After the war, she struggles financially working in a mothball factory until she receives a Hiroshima bombing survivor's pension and is able to live well for the rest of her life. Miss Toshiko Sasaki, a 20-year-old clerk working at the East Asia Tin Works. Sasaki's parents and underachieving brother rely on her financial support. As she begins her day at work on the morning of August 6, a bomb goes off. To recover from her injuries, she requires months of physical therapy as well as numerous surgeries to regain the use of her limb. She eventually converts to Catholicism and becomes a nun after the war is finished. Dr. Masakaze Fuji, a 50-year-old doctor who is successful enough that he is able to work at a private clinic and turn people away patients. The clinic of Dr. Fuji is knocked over and falls into the nearby Kyo River during the bomb. However, Dr. Fuji survives and manages to drag himself to the shore when he falls into the river. Injured for a long time, he eventually returns to work as a doctor, aiding the survivors of the disaster. In order to cope with his trauma, Dr. Fuji rebuilds his clinic and indulges in a life of luxury. A gas leak in his house kills him 2 decades later. Father Wilhelm Kleinsorge, a Jesuit German priest who works and lives in a mission in Hiroshima. When the bomb goes off, he is reading in his room when it goes off, and although the mission is spared most of the damage due to the stronger foundations, he is left stunned and bleeding profusely around his home. Following his recovery, he begins to aid others in need and travels with other priests to Asano Park, where he helps with restoration and preaches the gospel to those who are in need there. Though initially recovering, Father Kleinsorge is struck down again years later and continues to be troubled with radiation sickness for the remainder of his life. Dr. Terufumi Sasaki, a young doctor working at the Red Cross Hospital in Hiroshima. Due to the fact that Dr. Sasaki took an earlier train to work on the morning of the bombing, but also because he was standing in front of an open window, he survived. In his whole institution, he is the sole doctor who is uninjured and able to begin treating patients immediately. For the first few days following the attack, Dr. Sasaki worked non-stop and without rest. For the first 3 days, he is unable to call his mother and inform her that he is alive. Dr. Sasaki is able to resume his normal routine after the crisis passes, and he finally marries and has further success in his clinic, eventually becoming affluent and well-respected. The Reverend Kiyoshi Tanimoto, an American-educated Methodist minister who is eager to prove to the Japanese government that he is a loyal citizen after he decides to return to his home country. Matsuo Tanimoto is moving a friend's daughter when the bomb goes off. He manages to survive the blast by hiding behind some large rocks in a yard and helping his friend's daughter move. Soon after the disaster, Mr. Tanimoto is reunited with his entire family. He and his family arrive at Asano Park, where he begins to assist the injured and displaced people in any way he can. After the war, he sets out to raise money for the victims of the bombing and to construct a peace center in Hiroshima as a memorial. Unfortunately, after a while, his efforts come to be perceived by most as attention-seeking, and he decides to cease gathering money for his cause. The rest of his life, he and his wife run an adoption center out of their house. 1914 saw the birth in Tianjin, China of American author and journalist John Hersey. As the son of Protestant missionaries who spoke Chinese fluently, Hersey was able to communicate with native speakers before learning English. When Hersey was 10, his family returned to the United States. As a student at Yale University, Hersey was a member of the Skull and Bones Society, one of the most prominent fraternities in the university. During World War II, Hersey became an overseas correspondent for Time magazine after starting work there in the fall of 1937. Hersey served as a war correspondent in both the Pacific and European theaters of the conflict during the Second World War. When the Allies invaded Sicily, he went with them and was recognized by the Secretary of the Navy for his contributions in helping to appropriately evacuate wounded soldiers from Guadalcanal. When he wrote Men on Baton in 1942 and then Into the Valley a year later in 1943, he had begun producing full-length non-fiction volumes. Following the publication of A Bell for Adano in 1944, Hersey went on to win the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction that year. A letter written by a Jesuit missionary who had survived the atomic bomb was uncovered by Hersey while working for The New Yorker in Japan after the war. In order to meet additional survivors, Hersey decided that this would make an interesting piece and went to see the missionary. As a result, he wrote the article and book Hiroshima, for which he received widespread acclaim. Aside from The Wall, Hersey wrote the Algiers Motel incident and the '67 riots on the riots in Detroit. For the next 18 years, Hersey taught 2 writing classes at Yale, where he remained an instructor until 1984. 40 years after the bomb was dropped, Hersey returned to Hiroshima to visit the people he had written about in his book. The Aftermath was published in the New Yorker's July 1985 edition as a follow-up to Hiroshima. The piece was then included as the book's 5th and final chapter at the end of the printed copies. When John Hersey died on March 24, 1993, he was laid to rest in Martha's Vineyard. 6 grandkids were left to mourn the loss of their father. Thank you for listening in Audiobook Academy. Don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button for more content like this. See you in next video.